All right, so thanks so much again for doing this. My first question to you is tell the audience a little bit about yourself and how you started in the community.
Yeah, so my name is Keisha Williams. I am a licensed therapist, as well as a relationship coach. I started my career back, oh my gosh, it's been over a decade that I started as a therapist, and opened my own private practice as a clinician about 3 years ago. Um, and I have branched out into relationship coaching just to be more of a resource to people who may not want like the clinical experience of therapy, but may need some of the expertise.
So tell me a little bit about the work that you do in your current role, because oftentimes I would talk to therapists and they would work with different populations, some with kids, others with teens and adults. What's that like with you?
Yeah, so my current clientele are couples in particular. I started my career working with kiddos directly, and that was kind of my passion. That was my whole focus because my mindset at the time was like kids are the future, right? So I would love to impact those young minds. So that's how I started my career. And over time, it just morphed, right? So through my the jobs that I worked at, I had the opportunity to work with the whole family dynamic where I did in-home therapy, serving the kiddo in their family context. Through that experience, I would meet with the parents alone to kind of like guide them and like how they were impacting the kiddos and like supporting their parenting and things like that. And I realized that I really had a strong impact working with that couple dynamic. And that's kind of what influenced me to kind of reroute to really just deal with the parents directly. And I was kind of naturally gifted, if I could put it that way, with kind of reaching them. So from that experience, I went and got specialized training as a Gottman trained couples therapist that really kind of took me over the edge. And I really learned like what the current research was saying to kind of help though that population. So that's who I target now. I target couples to do that relationship component. And I specifically thrive with married couples, but I do also offer dating couple resources as well as premarital.
Oh, that's nice. So tell me a little bit about the modalities that you use when working with couples, because oftentimes there's CBT, there's relational therapy,
Mhm.
there's ketamine-based therapy. So what specific
Mm.
method do you use for your practice?
Yeah, so for couples counseling, I rely heavily on the Gottman method. Doctors John and Julie Gottman, their approach or the methodology to couples counseling is heavily researched. They started with their relationship love lab and followed couples over a decade and kind of learned like the do's and don'ts, if you will, the masters and disasters of relationship. And then they came back and created interventions to really help couples stay together. One of the things that the Gottman method is kind of famous for is that Dr. John Gottman was able to predict with over a 94 percentage if a couple will stay together or divorce, right? So that is research that methodology I heavily rely on. I also offer biblical based counseling. So that's another methodology that I use. I'm currently a doctoral student. I'm studying Christian leadership. So that's something that I draw from into my approach. I also use things like when I'm doing more individual within a couple, that's where I might use like some trauma informed therapy, or I might use that cognitive behavioral CBT method and things of that nature. I also like to use insight oriented heavily because I believe that some people are just not dialed into like where their behaviors are coming from. So that insight oriented approach really helps them, as well as teaching some kind of self soothing so that if a couple or one person in the couple is getting flooded, I can give them those techniques so that they can regulate their emotions as well.
A lot of different modalities. Which one has been your favorite?
Yeah. So the top two, hands down, would be biblical based and Gottman method, right? Gottman method really kind of moves a therapist away from the traditional talk therapy, which I think is pretty historical. When therapists offer couples counseling, they really use that kind of talk therapy, whereas the Gottman method kind of puts the therapist in the position of a mediator. So we encourage more dyadic interaction from the couple, and we use a step in, step out approach where we step in, set you up to like reformulate how you engage with your spouse. And then we step out and give you an opportunity to practice that live in session. And then I'm a huge proponent of homework. And one of the things that I always tell my clients, whether individual cases or in couples therapy, is that you can only learn so much from me here in, the confines of a session. The transformation is going to happen outside of session when you practice what you're learning. So that's why I give homework to kind of support the change and the growth outside. And the other is that biblical base, right? I love to kind of anchor people with sound theology from the scripture.
Mm-hmm. So is the because I've talked to a therapist about sort of the biblical sort of method, and oftentimes I remember saying to her that when when using that method, oftentimes you know when people do therapy, especially on the biblical method, they're usually guided by their faith. Was that something that you took into consideration when using the biblical method?
It is. It is. So I identify as a Christian, right? A lot of people are kind of entrenched in the either religious or spiritual verbiage, right? I don't consider myself religious in that I define religion as man's rules to get to God. So I'm not religious in that, right? And I'm not spiritual in the realm of like I believe in crystals and things in that. I don't. So I identify as a Christian and I relate more to a spiritual terminology compared to religious just because of it usually feels icky to people. So yeah, I definitely pull my faith as far as like how I interact with God and how I interact with the scriptures in like exegeting, which is just another form of like studying the word of God. And I bring all of that into my sessions.
Yeah, yeah, the whole spiritual and kind of religious, they might seem the same to people, but it's not exactly the same.
Mm, I
Yeah.
would agree with you.
Hmm. My next question is, like what have clients ever let me rephrase that. What have you learned in doing this type of work, and what do you hope to learn in terms of something new that you would like to learn as a counselor?
What have I learned in doing this work? I've learned that people have a misunderstanding of what marriage is, right? And I think we have seen over time an increase in divorce rates. And I personally attributed that to not understanding like the sacredness of marriage, right? So one of the things that I've learned just with the way that I've studied different mythologies and things like that is how to connect people back to that, right? So one of the things you'll hear me say if you follow any of the like social media stuff that I do is that marriage is God's idea. It was from the beginning of time when we see Adam and Eve. That was the first marriage in the biblical sense, right? So I like to bring that into the work that I do. As far as something that I would like to learn more about, um, hmm. Well, right now I'm, I'm a literal student, so I'm already consuming a lot of information, and just trying to grow more in that specialty, as far as like Christian-based counseling. Um, I do think that there's a current call for me to move into like serving men and husbands more intentionally. And that's something that I'm trying to kind of submit myself to learning to figure out how to better support them in that way.
Hmm. It's really interesting that you point the concept of marriage as it's sort of this defining thing. I've heard that often I've seen families and stories where they often, come from blended families or from divorced parents. So, is that something that you've seen with a lot of clients, that coming from that background?
Yeah. Oh, for sure, right? Because divorce rates are so high, but people want to be in relationship, there's remarriages that's happening, right? So I definitely see some of that taking place in my clientele. And I will say this, I think some people have experienced a lot of shame around getting a divorce, especially when they think about like, oh, the Bible doesn't advocate for that. And I want to very clearly say that there is no shame if a person is to or a couple is to seek me out and say, well, this isn't my first marriage, I've been married before, or I'm seeking you out for premarital and I'm just coming off of the divorce, like there is no shame, right? Like the things of old have passed away, and who am I to hold you to that, right? I will meet you in the new that you're walking into. So yeah, I do see some of that, and I honor that union that they're bringing before me.
Hmm. Lastly, what can other people take away from this conversation? Like how can sort of students get involved with the whole counseling aspect and look into um, figure out ways for how they can use the Gottman theory or whatever sort of a practice that they can into, their work as a counselor.
Yeah. So, if anyone is interested in becoming Gottman trained, that is something that you can just search. The Gottmans have like ongoing trainings that they offer. There's level 1, 2, and 3 trainings, and then there's a certification track. So you can just look up the Gottman method, and you can find the most upcoming training for level 1 if you're a student. Let's say you're maybe in a master's program of counseling, or let's say that you are already a licensed clinician but you want to get more specialized and offer couples counseling, then you can start with level 1 of that training, and you do have to complete level 3. I'm a level 3 trained Gottman trained therapist. So you have to complete level 3 before you can enter the certification track to become a certified Gottman therapist.
All right. All right.